in the early 19th century, when America was still a young nation struggling between dreams of progress and the harsh reality of poverty. A child named John Davison Rockefeller was born on July 8, 1839, in a small wooden farmhouse in New York. The house was nothing grand, creaking floorboards, a leaky roof, and walls that whispered the struggle of a working-class family. But within those modest walls lived a boy who would one day change the way the world understood money, business, and power. His father, William Avery Rockefeller, was a traveling salesman who called himself a botanic physician, peddling miracle cures and secret oils that cured nothing but filled his own pockets. He was a man of charisma and cunning, who believed that words could earn more than work ever could. His mother, Eliza Davison Rockefeller, was his opposite, a devout, disciplined, and deeply moral woman who believed that hard work and honesty were the only paths to true success. Between this strange combination of a scheming father and a saintly mother, young John grew up learning the two most valuable lessons of his life: how to deal with people and how to deal with money. He would later say that he learned thrift, discipline, and faith from his mother, but business instinct from his father. From his earliest years, John showed a fascination with numbers. While other children in the countryside spent their time playing games, chasing chickens, or fishing by the creek, Rockefeller was happiest when he was counting. He kept notebooks where he recorded every cent he earned and every penny he spent. His handwriting was neat, his records perfect, and his logic cold and practical even at that age. The family didn't have much. Sometimes dinner was just cornbread and milk, but John never complained. He studied the way his mother stretched every coin and began to see that money itself wasn't evil or magical. It was a tool, and those who could control that tool with intelligence and patience could shape their own destiny. By the time he turned 10, he had already developed an obsession with saving and recording. Neighbors often laughed that the boy counted every bean before eating and every step before spending. What they didn't know was that this small-town child had the mindset of an accountant, the soul of a planner, and the focus of a man who already saw the world as one giant balance sheet when his family moved to Cleveland, Ohio, in 1853. Rockefeller was a quiet teenager, but with a determination that startled his teachers. He loved math, excelled in business studies, and believed education was the best investment anyone could make. Yet he also knew he couldn't afford college. So at the age of 16, he did something few boys his age had the courage to do. He went out to find work. He dressed neatly, copied his references by hand, and walked from office to office, knocking on doors, asking for a job. Day after day, he was turned down until finally, on September 26, 1855, his persistence paid off. He was hired as an assistant bookkeeper at Hewitt and Tuttle, a small produce commission firm in Cleveland. That date became so special to him that for the rest of his life, he celebrated September 26th as his personal job day, more important than his birthday. Rockefeller's first job paid only 50 cents a day, but to him it was a fortune, not in money, but in opportunity. He was punctual, polite, and painfully precise. Every cent was accounted for, every figure checked twice. His coworkers often joked that John treated the company's ledger like a Bible, and in a way, he did. His deep faith and discipline blended perfectly with his business instincts. Each day, He arrived early, stayed late, and kept notes about everything he learned: how markets worked, how shipments were priced, how profits were divided. In the dim candlelight of the office, surrounded by papers and ink, Rockefeller began to understand something few others could see: that business wasn't about luck, it was about systems. If you could control cost, reduce waste, and reinvest wisely, you could build something that would last forever. Outside work, he lived as simply as possible. He walked to the office to save on carriage fares. He refused to spend money on unnecessary luxuries. Even at that young age, he donated a portion of his tiny income to his church, saying, "If I cannot give 10 cents out of $1, I'll never give 10 million out of 100 million. His generosity wasn't for show, it was principle. He believed wealth came with responsibility, and he practiced it even before he had any real wealth. That early discipline, that strange mixture of faith, frugality, and focus, became the foundation on which he built his empire. By the time Rockefeller was 18, he had saved more money than most grown men of his neighborhood. People called him overly serious, even boring, but Rockefeller didn't mind. He had already learned that excitement fades, but efficiency lasts. His heroes were not warriors or adventurers, but accountants and businessmen. He admired balance more than brilliance. The way he saw it, the world rewarded those who worked quietly, thought logically, and never stopped learning. Every evening, when the sun went down and Cleveland's streets grew quiet, John would sit by the lamp in his small rented room, balancing his books, thinking of the future. He dreamed not of luxury, but of independence, to never again depend on someone else for a paycheck. His dream was not wild or romantic, it was deliberate. He wanted to build something steady, something that would grow as slowly and surely as compound interest. Little did he know that his discipline, his ledgers, and his long hours would soon lead him to oil, and oil would make him the richest man the world had ever known. But in those first quiet years, before the refineries, before the billions, before the fame, there was only a boy with a pen, a prayer, and a dream, a poor boy living in a rich dream, determined to count every step toward destiny. When John D. Rockefeller stepped out of the dim, dusty bookkeeping office in Cleveland after months of quiet, hard work, he was not just a young man with a job, he was a thinker sharpening his first blade of ambition. By the late 1850s, America was an untamed marketplace of dreams. Railroads were expanding, factories were rising, and trade was becoming the heartbeat of a restless nation. Rockefeller, still in his teens, watched the economy like a scientist watches chemical reactions. He understood that money wasn't made in moments of luck, but in systems that controlled chaos. Each day in that office had taught him the sacred rhythm of buying low, selling high, and trusting numbers more than emotions. He had started as a bookkeeper, but now he could read markets like other men read maps. He saw profit margins where others saw risk. So, when the time came to take his first real step into business, he did what few at his age dared. He decided to become his own boss. With just a few $100s saved from months of penny pinching and a small loan co-signed by his father, Rockefeller entered a partnership with a young Englishman named Maurice B. Clark, a man who shared his work ethic and distrust for waste. Together, they opened a modest produce commission, firm Clark and Rockefeller trading in grains, meats, and miscellaneous goods. Their first office was nothing more than a rented room with wooden floors, 2 desks, and ledgers stacked in corners. But for Rockefeller, it was a kingdom of purpose. He treated every transaction as if it were a royal decree. He negotiated with farmers, inspected shipments, and personally ensured that not a single cent was unaccounted for. His reputation grew quickly. In a time when business was often reckless and speculative, Rockefeller's calm precision stood out like a lighthouse in fog. He refused to gamble, refused to guess, refused to act on impulse. If he didn't understand a deal, he simply walked away. Don't be afraid to give up the good to go for the great. He would later say, but even greatness, in his eyes, had to be earned through data, not dreams. His company turned small profits in the beginning, but he reinvested every dollar back into the business. He paid his workers fairly, kept his books immaculate, and learned the value of timing. He knew that in the business world, success was rarely lauded, was steady, predictable, and built through patience. Where others sought instant wins, Rockefeller sought permanent systems. He saw inefficiencies as the enemy, and he waged a quiet war against waste in every form. He once said, "I always tried to turn every disaster into an opportunity." And that mindset became the signature of his empire. The young businessman's discipline bordered on obsession. Every morning he arrived before his employees, walking through the cold Cleveland streets with a black notebook in his hand. He noted prices, calculated interest, and tracked market trends before most men had even finished breakfast. He memorized shipping rates and railroad schedules. To him, knowledge was currency, and preparation was profit. His sharp eyes noticed things others ignored, how a delay in freight could ruin margins, or how buying grain directly from farmers could save middleman costs. He wasn't just working, he was designing an invisible blueprint for efficiency. Within 2 years, his small trading firm began turning substantial profits. But Rockefeller didn't celebrate, he analyzed. While his partner, Maurice Clark, enjoyed the growing returns, John was already thinking beyond produce. He looked at industries that were inefficient, chaotic, and ripe for reform. In the late 1850s, nothing fit that description better than oil. At the time, crude oil was discovered in Pennsylvania, and people were losing fortunes chasing quick success. Wells would boom one week and dry up the next. Speculators were gambling everything, but Rockefeller saw something different. He didn't see oil as chaos. He saw order waiting to happen. He realized that the real profit wouldn't come from finding oil, it would come from refining it, distributing it, and controlling it. But before he could take that giant leap, he needed to master the art of management. So he perfected his firm as his training ground. He built relationships with banks, learned the delicate balance between borrowing and investing, and developed the skill that would later terrify his competitors: negotiation. Rockefeller never raised his voice, never argued, and never rushed. He let silence do the work. When others fidgeted in tension, he sat still, calm, and unreadable. Many said his stare could end a discussion. That quiet control became his weapon in a world that mistook noise for power. He once told a colleague, "Success comes from keeping the mind clear, the soul calm, and the books balanced." It wasn't poetry, it was a formula, and he followed it like scripture. As the Civil War broke out in 1861, markets across America shook violently. But Rockefeller's business didn't collapse, expanded. He used the war's demand for supplies to strengthen his trading network. While others panicked, he calculated. He learned how to survive crisis by controlling what he could and minimizing what he couldn't. His calm confidence became contagious, and soon investors trusted him with larger deals. He was no longer the poor boy from New York. He was a young man with a method. Every ledger line, every coin saved, every cautious risk was carving the foundation of something enormous. Looking back years later, Rockefeller would say that his partnership with Clark taught him the most valuable lesson of his life, that control of self, of business, of numbers, was the secret ingredient of all success. That belief turned a small trading office into a launchpad for one of history's greatest fortunes. By the time the war ended, Rockefeller had mastered the rhythm of commerce. He could predict market movements almost instinctively, not by luck, but by logic. He was ready to move beyond produce, beyond the local markets, into something bigger, something black, sticky, and waiting beneath the earth. His journey from bookkeeper to businessman had prepared him for the next stage of evolution, the birth of Standard Oil. But in those first golden years of learning and trading, what truly defined John D. Rockefeller was not oil, not money, not power, it was patience. He understood that every empire begins with small, careful steps, and that the greatest fortunes are often built not in moments of brilliance, but in the quiet persistence of men who refuse to waste even a penny. That is how America's first billionaire made his first business deal, not with greed, but with grace, not in noise, but in numbers, not in haste, but in history. As John D. Rockefeller's young business began to find its rhythm, his greatest strength wasn't money or even intelligence, it was discipline born from faith. In an age where businessmen chased quick fortunes and lost them just as quickly, Rockefeller stood apart as a man who believed that order was a form of worship. Every morning before stepping into his office, he paused for prayer. To him, business and belief were not separate worlds. They were two sides of the same divine coin. His mother, Eliza, had raised him to live by the principle that success without morality was failure in disguise. So even as he balanced ledgers and built partnerships, Rockefeller balanced his soul with the same precision. He tithed regularly, donating 1/10 of his small earnings to the Baptist Church, and taught Sunday school every week. His colleagues couldn't understand it. How could a man so consumed by money also be so consumed by humility? But Rockefeller saw no contradiction. God gave me money, he would later say, and I believe the power to make it carries the responsibility to use it wisely. That faith gave him an inner calm that few men possessed. When markets trembled, he did not. When competitors panicked, he waited. He believed that patience was not just a business tactic, but a spiritual discipline. The Civil War had left America bleeding, its economy unstable. But Rockefeller's calmness turned uncertainty into opportunity. He expanded his produce business strategically, never overreaching, never letting greed cloud his logic. To him, numbers were sacred truths. Every figure on a page was a reflection of honesty. His ledgers became almost a religious ritual, each entry written neatly. No smudges, no erasures, because accuracy was respect both to God and to work. In those long, quiet nights, When oil lamps flickered and the city outside slept, Rockefeller stayed awake with pen in hand, balancing books and thoughts alike. He would later recall, "I had every opportunity to go wrong, but God held me by the hand." Despite his rising success, Rockefeller remained astonishingly humble. He avoided luxury, traveled simply, and kept his life free from indulgence. His breakfast was plain oatmeal, fruit, and coffee. He believed waste was sin, whether of money, time, or energy. He famously said, "Save when you can, and not when you have to." That principle guided his days. When he started earning larger profits, he didn't buy fancy clothes or expensive watches. Instead, he invested in efficiency, better tools, better systems, better people. He viewed his employees not as tools of labor, but as extensions of his purpose. If they worked hard and stayed loyal, he rewarded them generously. If they failed, he taught them discipline. His office was silent, almost like a chapel. Workers learned to whisper, not out of fear, but out of respect for the atmosphere he created, one of precision, peace, and purpose. Rockefeller's family life reflected the same quiet balance. In 1864, he married Laura Celesta Setti Spellman, a woman whose intelligence and moral strength matched his own. She was a teacher, a philanthropist, and a devout Christian. Together, they built a household that valued simplicity and service. Their evenings were not filled with parties or banquets, but with music, reading, and conversation about faith and society. Rockefeller often said his wife's calm voice was his anchor in every storm. Their home was warm but unpretentious, elegant not in wealth but in order. Setti managed the household budget with the same precision John managed his ledgers, and together they raised their children to see money as a tool for purpose, not pride. He once wrote in his diary, "I want to make money so I can do good with it." That simple line defined his philosophy: earn through honesty, spend through wisdom, and give through grace. His focus, however, could be frightening. Even as a young man, Rockefeller possessed a steel-like concentration that few could match. When he worked, nothing could distract him, not noise, not chaos, not even crisis. Colleagues said he could read a financial report while a train roared past his window and never look up once. That intense focus came from his belief that every minute misused was a debt, unpaid to God. He counted not only his money, but his time. He planned his days, scheduled his meetings, and reviewed his goals nightly. The same religious devotion that guided his faith guided his routine. He woke early, worked methodically, and never allowed emotion to dictate his decisions. If a deal went wrong, he didn't curse, he calculated. If a partner betrayed him, he didn't seek revenge, he reorganized. His calmness unnerved his rivals. They mistook silence for weakness, not realizing it was his greatest weapon. As his fortune grew, so did his sense of divine purpose. He believed that his growing wealth was not luck, but responsibility. He often quoted the Bible's parable of the talents, saying, "To whom much is given, much will be required." That belief laid the moral groundwork for what would later become the Rockefeller Foundation, one of the most powerful philanthropic forces in modern history. Even in his early years, he funded church repairs, supported freed slaves' education after the Civil War, and donated to struggling schools. His giving was never for reputation, it was strategy. He wanted to build systems that improved lives permanently, just as he built businesses that lasted generations. And yet, despite his unwavering faith and discipline, Rockefeller was not without inner struggle. He often questioned whether wealth could coexist with purity. There were nights when he prayed for clarity, asking if ambition was drifting into arrogance. Those were the moments that shaped him the most. He reminded himself that self-control was the highest form of success. He once told a pastor, "I never allowed myself to lose temper, not because I had none, but because it wastes energy." His calmness wasn't natural. It was trained. His spirituality wasn't ritual. It was reason. To Rockefeller, business was a form of stewardship, the careful management of the gifts entrusted to him. By the end of his 20s, Rockefeller had built a reputation as Cleveland's most reliable and honest businessman. He was admired for his integrity, respected for his precision, and even feared for his persistence. But more than all that, he was centered, spiritually, mentally, and morally. Faith gave him direction, family gave him grounding, and focus gave him power. When he looked at the world, he didn't see chaos. He saw patterns. When he looked at money, he didn't see greed. He saw opportunity. And when he looked at himself, he didn't see greatness. He saw a servant of order. In that balance of humility and hunger, John D. Rockefeller found the formula that would carry him from a quiet Cleveland office to the throne of American industry. His story was no longer just about making money. It was about mastering oneself. And in that mastery lay the foundation of his empire, not built on luck or labor alone, but on faith, family, and focus, the three pillars that turned a bookkeeper into the world's first billionaire. The year was 1859, and the air across America carried the scent of change, not the smell of flowers or fresh rain, but something darker, heavier, and far more valuable: oil. In the hills of Pennsylvania, near a quiet town called Titusville, a man named Edwin Drake had struck the earth and discovered black, gold crude oil bubbling from the ground like a liquid promise. The news spread like wildfire, igniting the imaginations of dreamers, speculators, and hustlers from coast to coast. America had entered a new kind of gold rush, but instead of pickaxes and shovels, men now wielded barrels and drills. The land trembled with greed, chaos, and the thunder of opportunity. Among those who listened closely to the echo of this new discovery was a young businessman in Cleveland, John D. Rockefeller. He watched the frenzy unfold with his signature calm, while others rushed to Pennsylvania to dig holes in the earth. Rockefeller stayed still, studying, calculating, and waiting. He understood something that almost everyone else missed: that striking oil was luck, but refining it would be science. He saw that crude oil by itself was useless. It was messy, unstable, and unpredictable. But once refined into kerosene, it became light, the very light that could illuminate the night across the growing cities of America. And Rockefeller knew that whoever could refine and distribute that light efficiently would not just make money, he would make history. So, in 1863, Rockefeller made a decision that would forever alter his destiny. Using the profits from his produce business, he invested in a small oil refinery in Cleveland, joining forces with Samuel Andrews, a skilled chemist who had mastered the refining process. Their partnership was simple, yet revolutionary. Andrews brought the technical know-how, and Rockefeller brought the strategy, the order, and the relentless pursuit of efficiency. Together, they created what would soon become the most advanced refinery in the region. Where other refineries wasted materials and leaked profits, Rockefeller's operation functioned with the precision of a clock. Every drop of oil was accounted for, every byproduct repurposed, every cent optimized. He once said, "Waste is a crime against nature." Under his direction, barrels were reused, chemicals were recycled, and shipping was negotiated down to the last penny. For Rockefeller, perfection wasn't an option. It was the only acceptable standard. As demand for kerosene exploded across the nation, Rockefeller's refinery began to grow. Cleveland's skyline filled with smoke and the faint golden glow of refinery fires that burned through the night. But for Rockefeller, that smoke wasn't chaos. It was rhythm. It was progress. It was the heartbeat of an empire being born. He studied every inch of his business like a scientist studies cells. He reduced costs, improved safety, and demanded loyalty and excellence from every worker. He was quiet but commanding. People feared disappointing him more than they feared losing money. Even in his late 20s, he possessed an aura of inevitability, a man who didn't shout to lead, but whose silence carried authority. He would visit the refinery, hands behind his back, his calm eyes scanning every valve, every barrel, every worker, always thinking how to make the process smoother, faster, better. Those who worked under him said that Rockefeller could see profit in places others only saw dirt. But while Cleveland thrived on oil, Pennsylvania's drilling sites told a different story. The oil business was brutal. Wells went dry overnight. Fortunes rose and fell faster than the tides. Thousands gambled everything they owned on chance. But Rockefeller built his empire on control. He didn't dig for oil. He refined it, transported it, and sold it. In that difference lay his genius. While others tried to own oil fields, he sought to own the system. He studied supply chains, transportation costs, and even the politics of railroads. He realized that the real power in oil wasn't in the wells, it was in distribution. Whoever could move oil cheaply and reliably would dominate the market. So, he began negotiating with railroad companies, securing secret deals that allowed him to ship oil at lower rates than his competitors. This move, quiet, strategic, and unseen, gave him the competitive edge that no one else could match. It wasn't luck. It was logic. WEAPONIZED. As his profits soared, Rockefeller faced moral scrutiny, even from himself. He still prayed daily, attended church, and tithed faithfully, but he also knew that business was not a playground for sentiment. He believed that efficiency was a kind of righteousness, that in eliminating waste, he was honoring divine order. Yet his methods were controversial. Competitors accused him of manipulation, of unfair practices, of crushing small businesses. Rockefeller never responded with anger. He simply said, "Competition is a sin only when it leads to inefficiency." His focus remained absolute. Make the product cheaper, make it better, make it available to everyone, and it worked. Within just a few years, Rockefeller's refinery controlled nearly 1/3 of Cleveland's entire oil output. His small venture had evolved into a machine of precision, and that machine would soon take a name that would echo across continents: Standard Oil. But before that empire could rise, Rockefeller endured sleepless nights and heavy decisions. He faced betrayal from partners, sudden crashes in oil prices, and growing public suspicion. Yet, through it all, he never panicked. To him, setbacks were simply lessons disguised as loss. When an associate once accused him of being cold, Rockefeller calmly replied, "I have trained myself to think of money as a servant, never a master." That detachment gave him power, emotional discipline that made him unstoppable. As oil began to fuel lamps, ships, and factories across America, Rockefeller stood at the center of the storm, unmoved, unshaken, quietly expanding his empire from behind the shadows of his ledgers. He was no longer the boy counting coins in a wooden house. He was now the architect of America's first great industrial revolution, a man who turned chaos into chemistry, and chemistry into control. By the dawn of the 1870s, the world had changed forever. Oil had become the blood of modern civilization, and Rockefeller was its silent heartbeat. From the small refinery in Cleveland, he had built the foundation of what would become the largest, richest, and most controversial corporation in human history. The discovery of black gold had given birth to countless millionaires, but only one man had the patience, faith, and precision to turn it into an empire. That man was John D. Rockefeller, America's first billionaire in the making, and the man who proved that real power doesn't come from digging deeper into the earth, but from thinking deeper than everyone else. By the early 1870s, the name John D. Rockefeller had begun to echo in the corridors of American industry, whispered with awe and fear alike. What had started as a modest Cleveland refinery had now transformed into something far greater, a machine of precision, purpose, and power known as Standard Oil Company. For Rockefeller, Standard Oil was not just a business. It was an idea, the embodiment of order in a chaotic world. He believed that the oil industry was wild, wasteful, and dangerously unstable. Prices fluctuated wildly, refineries opened and closed overnight, and corruption ran deep. But where others saw disorder, Rockefeller saw opportunity. "We must bring light out of chaos," he said, and with that conviction, he began the most ambitious consolidation America had ever seen. His mission was simple but ruthless: eliminate waste, improve quality, stabilize prices, and unify the industry under one standard, his standard. In 1870, he formally incorporated the Standard Oil Company of Ohio, investing $1 million, an unimaginable sum for its time, alongside a small circle of trusted partners. But Rockefeller wasn't content with mere success. He sought perfection. He reorganized every part of his operation, from refining to transportation to sales. Each department functioned like a cog in an enormous, well-oiled machine, reporting to him through layers of accountability and secrecy. He demanded efficiency so absolute that even a few drops of spilled oil were treated as a sin. His offices were quiet, his employees disciplined, his methods mathematical. Nothing was left to chance. He applied his bookkeeping habits from boyhood to a national scale, knowing every number, every shipment, every rate. He rarely raised his voice, but his words carried weight. "Don't be afraid to give up the good to go for the great," he often told his staff, and he lived by that creed. As Standard Oil grew, Rockefeller began to buy out his competitors with a mix of charm, pressure, and precision. He approached rival refiners not with threats, but with calm logic. "Join us," he would say, and together we can bring order to this industry. For many, the choice was simple: either merge with Standard Oil and profit, or fight against it and perish. Those who resisted soon found themselves crushed under the weight of Rockefeller's strategic brilliance. He would undercut prices in local markets, flood them with cheap oil until rivals bled dry, then buy them out at a fraction of their worth. Once he owned them, he raised the quality and stabilized prices again. It wasn't mere aggression. It was orchestration. Competitors called him ruthless. He called it efficiency in motion. By 1879, less than a decade after its founding, Standard Oil controlled over 90% of America's refining capacity, a level of dominance no company had ever achieved before. But Rockefeller's empire wasn't built on brute force alone. It was sustained by innovation. He constantly sought new ways to make his operations more efficient. He introduced pipelines to transport oil directly from refineries to railroads, cutting middlemen out entirely. He created his own barrel factories, shipping companies, and warehouses, everything vertically integrated to reduce cost and risk. Even the waste from refining was repurposed into new products like lubricants, wax, and paraffin. In Rockefeller's world, nothing was useless. He once said, "Turn every disaster into an opportunity," and he did just that. When the Panic of 1873 devastated American businesses, Rockefeller saw it as his chance to expand further. While others collapsed, he quietly bought their assets at low prices, strengthening his grip on the oil kingdom. To him, crisis was simply another form of competition, a test of discipline and foresight. Rockefeller's influence extended beyond refineries. His most powerful alliance was with the railroads, the arteries of America's industrial age. He negotiated secret rebates, special rates that allowed Standard Oil to ship its product cheaper than anyone else. In return, railroads received guaranteed high-volume business, keeping their trains full and profitable. These deals gave Standard Oil an almost supernatural edge in cost control, allowing Rockefeller to undercut every rival with ease. When critics accused him of unfairness, he defended himself coolly. "It is business, not war. The man who saves a cent where another wastes it is a benefactor to society." Yet behind that calm philosophy was a growing storm. Independent refiners, crushed by his tactics, began to call him a tyrant. Newspapers painted him as a shadowy figure controlling the nation's wealth. But Rockefeller paid little attention to the noise. His faith told him that as long as he worked with honesty and purpose, the criticism of men mattered less than the judgment of God. Inside the Standard Oil headquarters, the atmosphere was unlike any business of the era. Employees worked in silence, their every move measured and meaningful. Every letter that left the office was reviewed for tone, precision, and grammar. Rockefeller believed that carelessness in words reflected carelessness in work. He rarely smiled, yet he inspired absolute loyalty. His managers adored him, fearing disappointment more than dismissal. He rewarded diligence with trust and punished arrogance with dismissal. His genius lay not in charisma, but in consistency. He never gambled, never speculated, never allowed personal emotion to cloud professional judgment. To him, wealth was simply a tool, a sacred resource to be multiplied and managed. When asked why he wanted to dominate the oil industry, he replied, "Because if I do not, someone less skilled will, and the world will suffer for it. To his critics, it sounded arrogant. To Rockefeller, it was destiny. By the late 1870s, Standard Oil was no longer just a company, it was a symbol of America's new industrial age. Its refineries produced light for millions of homes. Its profits fueled expansion across continents, and its operations set the gold standard for business organization. Yet the very perfection that made Standard Oil great also made it feared. The press began calling Rockefeller the Oil King, painting him as a man who controlled not just markets, but governments. But behind that image was still the quiet, meticulous bookkeeper from Cleveland, the man who rose before dawn, prayed before decisions, and believed that success without stewardship was failure. While the world saw an empire, Rockefeller saw only responsibility, the sacred duty of maintaining order in a chaotic, greedy world. In the shadows of his office, surrounded by maps, contracts, and reports, Rockefeller would sometimes pause, resting his hand on his ledger, and whisper a silent prayer of gratitude. He knew he had built something immortal, an organization so efficient that it seemed alive. Standard Oil was more than his creation. It was his reflection, disciplined, deliberate, and devoted to purpose. As the smoke from refineries rose to the heavens, it carried with it the spirit of a new America, one where industry replaced faith as the nation's religion, and Rockefeller was its most faithful believer. By the dawn of the 1880s, John D. Rockefeller had achieved what most men could only dream of, near total control over the American oil industry. His company, Standard Oil, had become a living organism, with its veins running through refineries, pipelines, railroads, and ports across the United States. It was said that every lamp burning in an American home flickered with his touch. Yet, as his empire expanded, so too did the storm gathering around him. The same discipline, precision, and strategy that had made him a genius also began to paint him as something darker, a monopolist, a tyrant of trade, the man who bent capitalism itself to his will. Rockefeller had always believed his actions were righteous, that efficiency was moral, and consolidation was civilization. But now, whispers filled the streets, headlines screamed his name, and the nation that once admired him began to fear the quiet man from Cleveland. The price of power, as he would learn, was not measured in dollars, but in doubt. Standard Oil's dominance was absolute. By using secret railroad rebates, aggressive buyouts, and unmatched efficiency, Rockefeller had reduced competitors to dust. From Pennsylvania to New York, from Chicago to the Gulf, his influence stretched like an invisible web. He controlled over 90% of the nation's refining capacity and dictated the price of kerosene across continents. Small refiners who once laughed at the young bookkeeper now found themselves bankrupt or absorbed. His reach extended so far that even the U.S. government began to tremble at his shadow. Newspapers started calling him the most powerful man in America. Yet, inside his office, Rockefeller remained eerily calm, a man of few words, fewer emotions, and no visible regret. He once told a reporter, "The day of combination is here to stay. Individualism is gone, never to return." To him, it wasn't tyranny. It was evolution. The weak resisted progress, and the strong organized it. But the public saw it differently. The very order Rockefeller believed he was bringing looked from the outside like oppression. Independent businessmen, crushed by Standard Oil's dominance, accused him of destroying the American dream. Former partners called him manipulative. Rival papers painted him as a man who prayed by day and prayed by night. The muckrakers, a new breed of investigative journalists, began digging into his empire's secret dealings. Among them was Ida Tarbell, whose father had been one of the small refiners forced out by Standard Oil. Her series of exposes in McClure's Elle magazine would soon turn Rockefeller's name into a symbol of greed. But even before her words hit print, Rockefeller sensed the tide turning. He could feel the weight of his empire pressing down not only on the markets, but on his own conscience. Despite the mounting criticism, Rockefeller's faith remained his anchor. He still prayed before decisions tithed to his church, and believed his wealth was a tool entrusted by God. Yet privately, the strain began to show. The once steady businessman developed severe stress-related ailments, hair loss, insomnia, and digestive problems. His hair fell out in clumps until he was forced to wear wigs. His body, once fueled by purpose, now carried the toll of power. Doctors advised rest, but rest was foreign to a man whose mind never stopped calculating. The same discipline that built his empire now chained him to it. Every newspaper headline that called him monster or tyrant cut deeper than he admitted. He knew he was being misunderstood, but he also knew that greatness rarely comes without isolation. If every man and woman understood what I have done, he once said quietly, they would thank me. But they didn't. The 1880s and 1890s brought a new kind of war, not of guns or oil, but of law. The Sherman Antitrust Act of 1890 marked the first major challenge to Rockefeller's empire. The U.S. government accused Standard Oil of stifling competition and violating the principles of a free market. For years, Rockefeller fought the charges in silence, operating through lawyers and executives while he withdrew more from public view. He stopped giving interviews, avoided photographs, and became almost ghost-like. His presence in the company grew distant, but his control remained absolute behind the scenes. He reorganized Standard Oil into a network of trusts and subsidiaries so complex that even regulators couldn't untangle it. He was playing chess while the world was still learning checkers. But deep inside, he began to sense the inevitable. The machine he had built was now too large to defend, too vast to control. In 1911, after decades of investigation, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that Standard Oil must be dissolved. The empire Rockefeller had built with divine discipline and human precision was declared a monopoly, illegal, unfair, and dangerous to democracy. The judgment shook America, but not Rockefeller. When the news reached him, he didn't rage or resist. Instead, he smiled. "The Lord gave," he said quietly, "and the Lord hath taken away." But what few realized was that this defeat was no loss at all. The breakup of Standard Oil split the company into 34 smaller corporations, many of which, including Exxon, Chevron, and Mobil, would later become some of the richest in the world. Rockefeller, who owned stock in all of them, saw his personal wealth multiply beyond imagination. Overnight, the world's first billionaire was born. The man who once counted pennies now watched his fortune rise to heights no king had ever known. Yet, even at the peak of wealth, Rockefeller's heart turned toward something deeper: redemption through giving. He devoted his final decades to philanthropy, funding universities, medical research, and education for the poor. He created the Rockefeller Foundation, a force that would shape global health and science for generations. He once said, "God gave me money, and I will use it for his work." To many, it seemed his faith had outlasted his ambition. But the price of his power never truly faded. The loneliness of control, the weight of public judgment, and the knowledge that his name would forever carry both greatness and controversy. These were burdens no amount of wealth could erase. By the time John D. Rockefeller died in 1937, at the age of 97, he had lived long enough to see his empire fall, transform, and rise again in new forms. America had changed, industry had evolved, and the boy from Cleveland had become a legend, half hero, half villain, yet fully human. His story was no longer just about oil or money. It was about the fragile balance between ambition and morality, faith and power, control and surrender. History would debate whether he was a saint of efficiency or a sinner of monopoly, but the truth was far more complex. He was a man who sought perfection in an imperfect world, and in doing so, paid the highest price. The price of power was not failure or loss, but understanding, the realization that greatness always demands something greater in return. As the 1870s gave way to the 1880s, America entered an era that would later be immortalized as the Gilded Age, a time of dazzling wealth, relentless ambition, and social contrasts so stark they seemed almost surreal. Cities like New York, Chicago, and Pittsburgh rose like steel and stone monuments to human ingenuity, their skylines pierced by specks, railroad bridges, and towering factories. Steam engines roared along the rail lines that stitched together a nation, carrying goods, coal, oil, and ambition across hundreds of miles. This was the age of the industrial titans, men who had risen from modest beginnings to dominate entire sectors of the economy. Among them, John D. Rockefeller, Andrew Carnegie, Cornelius Vanderbilt, and J.P. Morgan became names that evoked awe, envy, and fear. Rockefeller, already the empire builder behind Standard Oil, now moved within this elite circle, his quiet demeanor belying the immense power he wielded over the very lifeblood of the American economy. But wealth, as he had learned, was both a tool and a test. It elevated men to the heights of society while exposing them to scrutiny, rivalry, and moral judgment. The Gilded Age was glittering on the surface, but turbulent underneath. Magnificent mansions rose on Fifth Avenue and along the rivers of Pittsburgh, each a testament to the extraordinary fortunes accumulated through industry, railroads, and oil. Yet outside those gilded walls, millions of workers toiled for long hours in dark, dangerous factories, often earning barely enough to feed their families. Child labor was common, tenement housing crowded, and industrial accidents frequent. Rockefeller, while celebrated for his organizational genius, was also part of this paradox. He had created jobs and lighted America's homes with kerosene. Yet his dominance over the oil market stirred resentment and controversy. Critics argued that Standard Oil's control had stifled competition, manipulated prices, and concentrated wealth into the hands of a few. Yet for Rockefeller, the moral compass had always been clarity and discipline. Efficiency was not exploitation, and consolidation was not greed but stewardship. He saw the chaos around him as an opportunity to instill order, to teach the nation that wealth could be managed responsibly, even on a scale that seemed almost divine during this era. Rockefeller and his contemporaries understood that power was not just financial, it was social and political. The industrial magnates wielded influence over legislation, railroads, banking, and public opinion. Rockefeller, however, preferred to exercise his power quietly behind closed doors, relying on tact, secrecy, and strategic foresight. He negotiated favorable railroad rebates, secured advantageous supply contracts, and established trusts that allowed Standard Oil to operate as a unified system across multiple states, circumventing local inefficiencies and competitors' resistance. Each move was meticulously calculated, reflecting a mind that measured not only money but human behavior, timing, and perception. To him, empire building was an exercise in logic, patience, and moral order. He once said, "I always tried to turn every disaster into an opportunity," a principle he applied relentlessly as he watched his fellow titans expand their own empires in steel, railroads, and finance. The rise of these industrial titans also transformed American society and culture. Wealth became a visible badge of status, and philanthropy a moral responsibility, at least in theory. Mansions were adorned with marble, gilded ceilings, and chandeliers that sparkled like captured sunlight. Social gatherings were extravagantly orchestrated, with music, art, and etiquette serving as a language of power. Yet, for Rockefeller, display of wealth was secondary to management of it. His personal life remained disciplined, quiet, and devoted to faith and family, even as the world began to see him as a symbol of American capitalism. He believed that influence was more enduring than opulence, that legacy was measured in systems, schools, and hospitals, not parties or gold. And so, while the streets below teemed with the energy of working-class life, Rockefeller's empire quietly stretched its tendrils across the country, stabilizing industries, controlling markets, and creating the architecture of modern business, even as he ascended. Rockefeller observed the human cost of industrialization with a nuanced perspective. He funded schools, colleges, and medical research, understanding that wealth was not an end in itself, but a resource to shape society. He recognized that industrialization had created immense inequality, and he believed the powerful had a duty to mitigate its effects. His approach was methodical: invest in institutions, improve efficiency, and use influence to foster social stability. Unlike many peers who flaunted wealth purely for vanity, Rockefeller treated it as a tool of transformation. By the mid-1880s, he was not only controlling the oil industry, but also influencing education, health, and philanthropy in ways that would echo for generations. His example illuminated the paradox of the Gilded Age. Extraordinary accumulation of wealth could coexist with extraordinary responsibility, though it required discipline, vision, and moral courage. Thus, the rise of industrial titans was both a story of human ambition and a cautionary tale. Rockefeller stood at its center, a man whose meticulous calculations and unwavering focus allowed him to dominate markets and shape society, yet who carried the immense burden of public scrutiny, moral judgment, and historical expectation. He had learned that power demanded vigilance, patience, and ethical consideration, and that the Gilded Age, for all its sparkle, was a crucible where only the disciplined, the wise, and the strategically patient could truly thrive. Rockefeller's vision of order amidst chaos, of disciplined wealth amidst rampant speculation, and of purposeful influence amidst public scrutiny, set the template not only for Standard Oil but for the very structure of modern capitalism itself. In this age of light and shadow, of wealth and inequality, Rockefeller's story reminds us that the ascent of industrial titans was never merely about money. It was about mastering systems, people, and self, the very essence of power in a gilded world. By the 1890s, the glittering surface of the Gilded Age began to show cracks. The enormous fortunes amassed by industrial titans like John D. Rockefeller, Andrew Carnegie, and J.P. Morgan inspired A.W., but they also sparked fear, resentment, and public debate. Standard Oil, Rockefeller's creation, had become more than a company. It had become a symbol of concentrated power, a single entity whose reach extended into nearly every corner of American life. Railroads, refineries, pipelines, and markets were no longer independent. They flowed under the shadow of one man's strategic genius. While the nation's economy thrived and kerosene brightened countless homes, millions began to question whether such dominance was healthy for democracy. Newspapers and politicians described monopolies as the embodiment of greed, calling them robber barons who bent the law and crushed competition. The public outcry was amplified by a growing class of journalists, later called muckrakers, who uncovered corruption, price manipulation, and secret deals hidden beneath layers of trust agreements. The very brilliance that had allowed Rockefeller to organize, streamline, and stabilize an industry now made him a lightning rod for moral and political scrutiny. Rockefeller's response was characteristically methodical and disciplined. Unlike many of his contemporaries who might have reacted defensively or rashly, he relied on strategy and patience. He understood that public perception could be influenced, but not entirely controlled. He did not publicly argue with critics. Instead, he strengthened internal systems, ensured efficiency, and expanded philanthropic efforts, quietly balancing public sentiment with industrial dominance. He poured resources into hospitals, universities, and charities, understanding that influence was most enduring when paired with visible benefit to society. Still, the tension was palpable. State legislatures, consumer advocates, and rival business owners lobbied for regulation, while ordinary citizens debated whether Standard Oil represented progress or tyranny. The company's sheer scale, its ability to undercut prices and buy competitors, and its secretive railroad rebate agreements became focal points for national controversy. Yet behind the headlines and public fury, Rockefeller moved like a chess master, anticipating every challenge, every legislative maneuver, every potential threat to his empire. The pressure on Rockefeller grew as legal frameworks began to shift. The Sherman Antitrust Act of 1890 was intended to curb monopolistic practices, and Standard Oil, by its very existence, became the first major target of this landmark legislation. Legal battles dragged on for years, capturing the imagination of the nation. Critics painted Rockefeller as a puppet master whose hands controlled both the market and the people within it, a man who amassed unimaginable wealth while the little man struggled. But Rockefeller viewed the law differently. He believed that efficiency and consolidation were natural progress, not violation. By organizing the industry under a single, rational system, he argued, he was reducing waste, stabilizing prices, and providing reliable service to consumers. Monopoly, in his mind, was simply order realized at scale. Yet the tension between law, public perception, and business reality created a new kind of challenge, one that required not just intellect, but emotional and moral fortitude. This period also highlighted the human cost of industrial consolidation. Thousands of small refinery owners, once independent and proud, were absorbed or driven out of business. Some were angry, some resigned, and some bitterly attacked Rockefeller through the press and political lobbying. His personal discipline, unwavering focus, and strategic patience were contrasted against the very real human stories of displacement and economic disruption. While Rockefeller remained calm, meticulous, and unwavering, the nation began to grapple with a central question: how much power could one individual hold before it became a threat to society itself? Standard Oil, more than any other company, embodied that tension, the power to create wealth and progress, balanced against the moral and social responsibility that inevitably accompanied it. Despite the growing controversy, Rockefeller's philosophy remained clear. He was guided by a combination of personal faith, disciplined calculation, and a belief in stewardship. He understood that his actions would always be scrutinized, that history would judge him both for his accomplishments and for the methods by which he achieved them. Rather than react impulsively, he continued to refine operations, negotiate deals, and expand markets. He invested in infrastructure, shipping, and research, always thinking several steps ahead. He knew that public opinion could rise and fall like the tide, but that well-organized systems would endure. His calm, almost monastic approach to power allowed him to navigate crises that would have crippled lesser men. By the turn of the century, Rockefeller had become a figure larger than life, revered, feared, and endlessly studied. A man whose strategies and ethics would define corporate governance for generations. In the broader context, the rise of Standard Oil during the Gilded Age illuminated the duality of industrial power. On one hand, it brought stability, efficiency, and modern conveniences to millions. Kerosene lamps brightened homes, factories functioned reliably, and markets operated with unprecedented precision. On the other hand, it concentrated wealth, silenced competition, and provoked widespread social unrest. Rockefeller embodied both sides of this paradox, a visionary who believed in the transformative potential of organized industry, yet a man whose very efficiency inspired fear and resistance. The Gilded Age, with its glittering mansions and smoky industrial skylines, became the stage on which this drama of ambition, morality, and power played out. Through it all, Rockefeller moved quietly, strategically, and deliberately, a man acutely aware of both the brilliance and the burden of his dominance. By the end of this period, the nation had come to recognize that industrial titans like Rockefeller were not simply businessmen. They were forces of nature, reshaping society, economy, and politics with precision and relentless focus. Their power was immense, their influence enduring, and the moral questions surrounding their methods would ignite debates that continue to this day. Rockefeller himself, calm, disciplined, and deeply religious, understood that wealth carried profound responsibility, and that public scrutiny was simply the price of having the vision, skill, and discipline to build an empire. The story of monopolies and public outcry, therefore, is not merely a tale of conflict, but a lesson in strategy, patience, and moral complexity, a reflection of the human capacity to wield power wisely, and the inevitable tension that comes when extraordinary ability collides with public expectation. By the turn of the 20th century, John D. Rockefeller had amassed wealth so immense that even the richest of kings would have paused in disbelief. Yet, for Rockefeller, money was never an end. It was a sacred responsibility, a tool entrusted by God to be wielded with purpose, precision, and humility. While the nation debated monopolies, industrial dominance, and the ethics of concentrated power, Rockefeller quietly pivoted his focus toward philanthropy, understanding that true legacy was measured not in dollars hoarded, but in lives transformed. He systematically invested in education, medicine, and scientific research, creating institutions designed not for fame, but for lasting impact. Among the most notable were the University of Chicago, which would become a center of intellectual innovation, and the Rockefeller Institute for Medical Research, dedicated to combating disease. Every grant, donation, and initiative was meticulously planned, reflecting the same strategic brilliance that had guided Standard Oil, but now applied to human betterment. Rockefeller viewed philanthropy not as charity, but as engineered transformation, a way to organize social progress with the precision of an industrial empire. His approach to giving was revolutionary. Rather than dispersing money randomly, Rockefeller insisted on careful selection, rigorous accountability, and measurable outcomes. He believed that unorganized generosity could be wasted or misused, and that, like business, philanthropy required strategy, discipline, and foresight. This mindset shaped the emerging field of modern philanthropy, establishing standards for efficiency, transparency, and sustainability. Hospitals were not merely funded, they were restructured. Schools were not just endowed, they were evaluated for effectiveness. Scientific research received sustained support, allowing discoveries to unfold over decades rather than months. In Rockefeller's eyes, wealth had a moral dimension. It was a responsibility to build systems that multiplied human potential, reduced suffering, and left the world better than it was found at the same time. Rockefeller's personal life reflected the same principles, though the media and public frequently depicted him as a cold industrialist. Those closest to him saw a man of profound discipline, faith, and humility. He lived modestly, even amid unimaginable fortune, rising early, maintaining a simple diet, and spending hours in prayer and reflection. His home was orderly, quiet, and devoted to family, a stark contrast to the sprawling industrial complexes he controlled. His children were raised to value integrity, responsibility, and purpose over extravagance, embodying lessons that extended far beyond money. For Rockefeller, the measure of success was not the size of a bank balance, but the effectiveness of one's stewardship over resources, influence, and time. He believed that God's judgment would ultimately outweigh public opinion, and that ethical diligence in life and business would define true greatness. Rockefeller's philanthropy had an enormous ripple effect. By funding universities, he empowered generations of scholars to advance knowledge in fields ranging from economics to physics. By supporting medical research, he enabled breakthroughs that saved millions of lives and transformed public health worldwide. Through his foundation, he established programs in education, agriculture, and global health that became models for philanthropy for decades to come. In effect, he applied the principles of Standard Oil efficiency, scale, strategic planning to the betterment of society. Where industrial power had concentrated wealth, philanthropic power concentrated knowledge, innovation, and opportunity, creating structures that outlasted individual lifetimes. Rockefeller's vision was systemic, ensuring that every dollar invested had a measurable and sustainable impact, a philosophy that would shape modern charitable giving globally. Yet, this chapter of Rockefeller's life was not devoid of challenge or reflection. Critics continued to question whether the wealth that funded these philanthropic projects was morally earned, citing the monopolistic practices of Standard Oil and its effects on competition. Rockefeller did not shy away from scrutiny. He addressed it quietly through action rather than rhetoric. His response was embodied in results: hospitals built, schools funded, research advanced, and lives improved. History would eventually reconcile the tension between the methods of wealth accumulation and the responsible deployment of that wealth, showing that the true legacy of an industrial titan lies not only in empire, but in the enduring structures created for human progress. By the time Rockefeller approached the later decades of his life, he had become a figure of global significance. He had experienced the full arc of power, from humble beginnings to industrial dominance to public scrutiny, and finally to philanthropic leadership. His personal faith, disciplined focus, and moral philosophy guided each stage, giving coherence to a life that might otherwise have been fragmented by scandal, wealth, or ambition. In quiet moments, he reflected on the journey, the young bookkeeper from Cleveland who had learned the value of pennies, the industrious businessman who had transformed oil into empire, and the philanthropist who now turned empire into enduring human benefit. Rockefeller understood that the true measure of wealth was not in accumulation, but in responsible application, and that legacy was the enduring impact left on the world far beyond one lifetime. Ultimately, the story of John D. Rockefeller's philanthropy underscores a profound truth about the Gilded Age: extraordinary wealth, when coupled with discipline, moral responsibility, and strategic foresight, can transcend controversy and leave a lasting positive imprint on society. Rockefeller's vision combined industrial genius with ethical stewardship, demonstrating that power and responsibility are inseparable. He transformed the narrative of wealth from one of mere accumulation into a system of purposeful influence, setting standards for both business and charity that continue to guide leaders, innovators, and philanthropists today. His life offers a blueprint for understanding how extraordinary capability, disciplined focus, and moral intent can shape not just markets, but the world itself, a lesson as relevant now as it was over a century ago. A reminder that the legacy of wealth lies in the structures it builds, the lives it changes, and the moral clarity with which it is wielded. By the closing years of the 19th century, John D. Rockefeller had transformed not only the oil industry, but also the very structure of American capitalism. Yet, with immense power came immense scrutiny, and the public gaze had begun to focus sharply on Standard Oil and its enigmatic founder. While Rockefeller had always conducted business with meticulous discipline, society was now questioning whether such domination was ethical or even sustainable in a democracy. Newspapers, pamphlets, and political speeches increasingly criticized monopolistic practices, portraying Rockefeller as a puppet master manipulating markets and lawmakers alike. Editorials called him a robber baron, a term loaded with moral judgment and public outrage. Ordinary citizens, small business owners, and political leaders alike debated whether it was possible for one individual to wield so much influence without corrupting the economic and social fabric of the nation. The tension was palpable. Rockefeller, whose genius had once inspired admiration, was now the central figure in a national conversation about fairness, ethics, and the limits of corporate power. The scrutiny intensified as politicians began to propose and enact new regulatory measures aimed at curbing monopolies. The Interstate Commerce Act and the Sherman Antitrust Act became tools for confronting the unprecedented concentration of wealth. While these laws were ostensibly neutral, they were designed to challenge Rockefeller's methods, including secret railroad rebates, consolidation strategies, and aggressive buyouts that had effectively eliminated competition. In response, Rockefeller relied on his hallmark strategy of patience, discipline, and calculation. He did not publicly argue or rail against lawmakers. Instead, he maneuvered through legal, political, and social channels, ensuring that Standard Oil's operations remained largely unscathed. Behind the scenes, his lawyers, accountants, and managers meticulously documented every transaction, contract, and corporate restructuring, creating a legal shield of precision that would endure for decades. Rockefeller's approach demonstrated that true power was not just the ability to dominate markets, but the capacity to anticipate and navigate political and social turbulence with strategic foresight. The public backlash, however, was not limited to legal arenas. Muckraking journalists like Ida Tarbell amplified public anger by exposing the inner workings of Standard Oil in a series of investigative articles. Tarbell's work portrayed Rockefeller as a calculating, secretive figure, willing to crush competitors with ruthless efficiency, manipulate transportation costs, and exploit workers to build his empire. Her vivid storytelling captured the imagination of the American public, turning complex corporate maneuvers into moral narratives about greed, fairness, and power. Rockefeller's reputation became a battleground, not merely for profit, but for public perception, social trust, and historical legacy. While many admired his discipline and organizational genius, others saw only a man whose power threatened the very principles of free enterprise and equality. This duality defined the challenge of immense wealth in a democratic society. The line between genius and villainy was often drawn by perception, not reality. Amidst this storm, Rockefeller remained a study in composure. His personal discipline, cultivated over decades, allowed him to endure criticism without faltering. He continued to rise early, review ledgers, meet with executives, and pray daily, maintaining the structure and routine that had brought him success. He understood that public outrage, media attacks, and political pressure were temporary, while the systems he built were permanent. Yet, despite his calm exterior, the weight of scrutiny was real. Friends and family noted the quiet tension in his demeanor, the occasional moments of reflection where he considered the long-term consequences of his actions. The moral and social responsibility of wealth, once theoretical, had become a daily reality, requiring vigilance, patience, and foresight beyond mere business acumen. The backlash also spurred Rockefeller to expand his philanthropic activities, not as a public relations tactic, but as a deliberate exercise in social stewardship. He funded hospitals, universities, and research institutions at a scale never seen before, demonstrating that concentrated wealth could be harnessed for societal benefit. These initiatives were strategic as well as moral, by addressing education, health, and scientific progress. Rockefeller sought to stabilize society and legitimize the role of industrial power in public life. Philanthropy became a parallel arena in which he exercised influence, demonstrating that responsibility and generosity could coexist with economic dominance. In doing so, he redefined the narrative of wealth from one of mere accumulation to one of ethical obligation and structured contribution, a vision that would influence both contemporary and future industrial leaders as political and social pressures mounted. Rockefeller learned the intricate dance of balancing public perception, regulatory compliance, and corporate control. He negotiated with lawmakers quietly, restructured companies to comply with emerging regulations, and maintained rigorous operational standards to prevent scandals from escalating. His focus was on long-term stability, recognizing that power without responsibility or foresight could be fleeting. He understood that public opinion, law, and morality were interconnected forces that shaped the environment in which empires existed. Standard Oil, therefore, was more than a business. It was an adaptive organism, resilient in the face of scrutiny, responsive to evolving legal frameworks, and designed to endure. By the early 20th century, the challenges of power had shaped Rockefeller as profoundly as his early business successes. He had confronted public anger, regulatory scrutiny, and moral judgment, yet emerged with his wealth, influence, and discipline intact. The lessons of this period were clear. Immense power carries inevitable scrutiny, ethical responsibility, and personal sacrifice. Rockefeller's ability to navigate these challenges reflected not only his intelligence but his discipline, patience, and moral grounding, demonstrating that leadership at the scale of empires requires both strategy and conscience. The story of public backlash and political pressure in Rockefeller's life reveals a timeless truth. Power is inseparable from accountability, and the true measure of influence lies not just in domination, but in the capacity to endure, adapt, and act responsibly amidst scrutiny. By the early 20th century, John D. Rockefeller's Standard Oil had grown into an industrial leviathan, a sprawling network of refineries, pipelines, railroads, and distribution channels that touched almost every corner of the American economy. Yet with immense power came relentless legal scrutiny as the government, spurred by public outrage and investigative journalism, sought to challenge the dominance of one man's empire. The Sherman Antitrust Act of 1890 provided the legal framework to confront monopolies, but enforcing it against an entity as complex and cunning as Standard Oil proved to be a Herculean task. Lawyers, economists, and politicians found themselves navigating a maze of trusts, subsidiaries, and corporate interconnections, each layer meticulously engineered by Rockefeller to withstand external attack. The legal battles that ensued were unlike anything America had faced before, protracted, intricate, and high stakes, pitting the visionary genius of Rockefeller against the nascent power of federal regulation. Every hearing, every deposition, every contract became a battleground where law, strategy, and morality collided, highlighting the tensions inherent in the age of concentrated industrial power. Rockefeller himself approached these legal challenges with his characteristic calm and methodical precision. While the public saw courtrooms brimming with drama, he saw a process to be navigated logically. He delegated negotiations to trusted lawyers, studied precedent meticulously, and anticipated moves that regulators might attempt. His strategy was to defend Standard Oil not merely on technicalities, but by demonstrating the systemic efficiencies that made the company essential to the national economy. To him, consolidation was not exploitation but optimization. Standard Oil's dominance reduced waste, stabilized markets, and provided reliable fuel for an industrializing nation. Yet, despite this internal logic, the court of public opinion was far less forgiving. Newspapers painted Rockefeller as a puppet master, bending law and commerce to his will, while politicians debated the broader implications of corporate monopolies for democracy, small businesses, and citizens. Rockefeller's challenge was both legal and moral, to justify not just the structure of Standard Oil, but its right to exist as a dominant force in a free society. The battle culminated in one of the most famous legal confrontations in American history. Standard Oil, accused of violating antitrust laws, faced the full force of the federal government. Investigators meticulously documented every rebate, contract, and acquisition, attempting to prove that Rockefeller's empire had deliberately stifled competition. For weeks, months, and even years, legal teams pored over mountains of evidence, while public opinion oscillated between admiration for Rockefeller's genius and condemnation of his methods. In the courtroom, lawyers presented complex financial analyses, intricate charts of subsidiaries, and volumes of correspondence, each line scrutinized for evidence of monopoly. Rockefeller himself rarely appeared, observing from the shadows, his calm demeanor unshaken by the storm of accusations, the public scrutiny, and the mounting political pressure. His discipline, patience, and meticulous preparation became his shield, his empire, a fortress of corporate design, resilient against the combined forces of law, journalism, and public outrage. Throughout these trials, Rockefeller remained singularly focused on long-term strategy rather than short-term reputation. While critics sought immediate retribution, he understood that legal and societal systems moved slowly and could be anticipated, manipulated, and managed. He restructured Standard Oil to comply with emerging regulations without sacrificing operational control, creating a network of trusts and holding companies that allowed the business to continue functioning seamlessly. Each decision reflected his ability to think several steps ahead, integrating legal compliance, financial optimization, and strategic advantage into a single coherent plan. To Rockefeller, success in business was inseparable from mastery of the law, public perception, and systemic efficiency. His genius lay not merely in refining oil, but in refining the very rules by which commerce and governance interacted. The public fallout from these profound battles was profound. Muckraking journalists continued to expose the inner workings of Standard Oil, framing the company as a cautionary tale of unchecked corporate power. Politicians debated stricter antitrust enforcement, while citizens questioned the ethical limits of wealth and dominance. Yet Rockefeller's reputation as an industrial genius persisted, even amid criticism. His ability to endure scrutiny without losing strategic focus became a defining trait, demonstrating that true power requires both foresight and moral resilience. The legal challenges did not destroy Standard Oil. Instead, they forced it to evolve, adapt, and survive in a landscape increasingly shaped by regulation, accountability, and public awareness. Rockefeller's response set precedents for corporate governance, illustrating how intelligence, discipline, and ethical calculation could navigate the complex interplay of law, business, and society. Ultimately, the antitrust battles of Rockefeller's era highlight a central paradox of industrial power. The very brilliance that allows one man to dominate markets also attracts scrutiny, regulation, and moral questioning. Standard Oil's legal saga revealed the delicate balance between economic efficiency, legal compliance, and social responsibility. Rockefeller's legacy was shaped as much by these challenges as by his business triumphs, showing that immense power carries inherent obligations, and that the exercise of that power demands not only intelligence, but discipline, patience, and ethical foresight. By the time the Supreme Court ruled on Standard Oil's fate in 1911, Rockefeller had already demonstrated an extraordinary ability to survive controversy, anticipate regulatory outcomes, and ensure the enduring influence of his empire. The story of legal battles and antitrust challenges, therefore, is not only about law and commerce, but about the human capacity to wield extraordinary power responsibly, strategically, and with moral vision, a lesson in resilience, strategy, and the price of dominance. By the time the Supreme Court ruled in 1911 that Standard Oil must be dissolved, John D. Rockefeller had already demonstrated a lifetime of unparalleled foresight, strategic discipline, and adaptability. For decades, he had built an empire that seemed invincible, but with the increasing scrutiny of regulators, journalists, and the public, he now faced a profound test: how to preserve the legacy wealth and operational continuity of an empire that had become both a symbol of progress and a target of moral and legal criticism. Rockefeller approached the challenge with the same methodical precision that had guided him from his first Cleveland refinery to the heights of industrial dominance. Rather than react with panic, anger, or denial, he carefully analyzed every structural, legal, and financial aspect of Standard Oil, preparing for a transformation that would ensure its resilience and continued influence in a rapidly evolving economy. This period would come to define Rockefeller not only as a businessman, but as a master strategist and visionary who could navigate the turbulence of public opinion, regulatory reform, and historical judgment with unparalleled composure. The breakup of Standard Oil into 34 independent companies could have been perceived as a catastrophe. Yet Rockefeller turned it into an opportunity. He retained substantial stock in each entity, ensuring that while the corporate structure changed, his personal influence and wealth continued to grow. Some companies became household names in their own right: Exxon, Mobil, Chevron, and Amoco, each building upon the operational foundations Rockefeller had meticulously established. Rather than viewing dissolution as defeat, he understood it as evolution, an adaptation to legal and social realities without sacrificing long-term objectives. This approach demonstrated his profound understanding of resilience, that survival and influence were not dependent on static dominance, but on the ability to reorganize, preserve core principles, and exploit new frameworks for strategic advantage. Rockefeller's capacity to transform a legal setback into lasting strength reflected a mindset shaped by decades of disciplined calculation, strategic foresight, and moral purpose. This era of adaptation was not solely about financial maneuvers. It also demanded moral and social recalibration. Rockefeller was acutely aware of the continuing public criticism regarding monopolistic practices, economic inequality, and corporate ethics. In response, he intensified his philanthropic commitments, channeling resources into education, medical research, and public health initiatives. Foundations, universities, hospitals, and scientific institutions were funded with unprecedented scale and foresight. Rockefeller viewed philanthropy not as a distraction or concession, but as a complement to strategic business practice, an investment in societal stability, public trust, and enduring legacy. By creating systems that improved lives, he counterbalanced criticism, reinforced social responsibility, and demonstrated that resilience extended beyond business to encompass ethical stewardship. The interplay of wealth, influence, and responsibility became a defining feature of his later life, illustrating how adaptation requires both practical and moral vision. Internally, Rockefeller reorganized his approach to business and legacy planning. He delegated operational control to trusted executives while maintaining strategic oversight, ensuring that his companies continued to operate efficiently and profitably under new legal structures. He meticulously documented corporate practices, legal compliance, and strategic decisions, creating a framework that would endure for generations. His leadership style evolved from direct command to strategic orchestration, a recognition that sustaining influence required both empowerment and oversight. Rockefeller's ability to balance control with adaptation was a testament to his disciplined approach. He understood that rigidity in the face of change led to failure, whereas flexibility, anchored in principle, enabled survival and continued impact throughout this period. Rockefeller also engaged in quiet reflection, recognizing the human dimension of power. He considered the impact of Standard Oil's dominance on workers, competitors, and society at large, striving to align his actions with his faith and moral philosophy. While critics continued to debate the ethics of his methods, Rockefeller measured his success in terms of systems built, lives improved, and sustainable influence preserved. He understood that resilience was not simply about weathering external pressures, but about maintaining coherence, purpose, and moral clarity in the face of scrutiny. His personal life mirrored this philosophy. Disciplined routines, structured daily reflection, and commitment to family and faith provided the inner stability required to navigate an era of unprecedented legal, social, and financial turbulence. By the 1920s, Rockefeller's adaptation had ensured that both his wealth and influence remained secure. While Standard Oil's dissolution served as a case study in corporate resilience and strategic foresight, his story illustrated that immense power, when combined with discipline, strategic thinking, and ethical grounding, could withstand legal challenges, public scrutiny, and historical judgment. the ability to adapt, to reorganize, to redirect, and to sustain influence within changing frameworks became the hallmark of his later life. Rockefeller demonstrated that resilience was not merely reactive, but proactive, a deliberate design that integrated business acumen, legal foresight, public perception, and moral responsibility. Through this lens, the challenges of the Gilded Age, antitrust scrutiny, and social criticism became opportunities to codify principles of strategic adaptation that would influence business leadership for generations to come. Ultimately, the period of adaptation and resilience cemented Rockefeller's place in history, not only as the first American billionaire, but as a master of navigating complexity at unprecedented scale. He had faced public backlash, legal challenges, and moral scrutiny, yet emerged with his wealth, influence, and purpose intact. His ability to convert potential defeat into opportunity, to sustain operations under legal and societal constraints, and to align business strategy with moral stewardship set new standards for corporate resilience. Rockefeller's legacy demonstrates that true power is inseparable from foresight, discipline, and the capacity to adapt, a reminder that the endurance of empire, influence, and moral authority depends on the ability to navigate change without compromising principle, and that resilience is above all the careful orchestration of strategy, ethics, and vision in the face of adversity. As John D. Rockefeller entered the twilight of his life, he found himself standing at the crossroads of history, wealth, and influence, reflecting upon a journey that had begun in the modest confines of a Cleveland household and had stretched across the entirety of American industry. The empire he built, once criticized as monopolistic and ruthless, had transformed into a benchmark of efficiency, discipline, and systemic innovation. Yet Rockefeller's true legacy extended far beyond dollars or industrial dominance. It lay in the structures, institutions, and social transformations he meticulously cultivated over decades. Hospitals, universities, and research institutions bore his mark, each a testament not merely to his financial capacity, but to his vision of purposeful wealth applied to enduring human benefit. In these moments of reflection, Rockefeller understood that legacy is not measured by accumulation alone, but by the lasting impact one leaves on society, knowledge, and human progress, and that the decisions of a single life could echo for generations in ways invisible to the immediate eye. Rockefeller's approach to legacy was deliberate and methodical. He applied the same principles that had guided Standard Oil discipline, foresight, and organization to his philanthropic endeavors, ensuring that every contribution created sustainable systems rather than fleeting benefits. The University of Chicago, endowed with millions, was designed to foster intellectual innovation and societal leadership. The Rockefeller Institute for Medical Research was structured to support systematic scientific inquiry capable of generating breakthroughs that could transform healthcare globally. Foundations in education, public health, and global relief were established not for short-term acclaim, but for enduring influence with measurable outcomes and accountable governance. In this way, Rockefeller's legacy was not a collection of monuments, but a network of institutions designed to perpetuate human advancement, reflecting his belief that wealth, when wielded responsibly, carries the potential to reshape society itself. Yet legacy, Rockefeller realized, is inseparable from perception. For decades, he had been alternately revered and reviled, praised for brilliance and condemned for monopoly. Public opinion oscillated between admiration for his industriousness and criticism of his methods. Rockefeller faced a profound challenge: how to reconcile the duality of his life, the visionary industrialist and the scrutinized titan, with the desire to leave a coherent, positive imprint on history. He approached this by committing to moral and social stewardship, demonstrating that the accumulation of wealth carried not only rights but responsibilities. Through meticulous planning, disciplined execution, and a steadfast commitment to ethical purpose, Rockefeller transformed controversy into a platform for structured contribution, showing that true legacy is forged not merely through power, but through the responsible application of that power for societal good. The personal dimension of Rockefeller's legacy was equally significant. In his family life, he instilled values of discipline, responsibility, and purpose, ensuring that his descendants understood the moral weight of influence and the obligation to use wealth for constructive ends. His children were raised to combine education with ethical awareness, financial acumen with social consciousness. This private cultivation of virtue complemented his public endeavors, illustrating that legacy encompasses not only public achievements, but the character, wisdom, and integrity passed down through generations. Rockefeller understood that the institutions, wealth, and influence he amassed were temporary vessels. The enduring legacy would be the lessons, values, and frameworks left behind for others to navigate, improve, and sustain. The broader societal impact of Rockefeller's legacy was profound. By the time of his passing in 1937, at the age of 90, he had witnessed the transformation of the American economy, the evolution of regulatory frameworks, and the maturation of philanthropic institutions on a scale unprecedented in human history. Standard Oil's dissolution had not diminished his influence. Rather, it had diversified it, creating multiple independent companies that continued to drive innovation and economic growth. His philanthropic networks had initiated breakthroughs in medicine, education, and public health that improved millions of lives globally. In sum, Rockefeller's legacy was structural, systemic, and transformative, demonstrating the remarkable capacity of one individual to shape industries, societies, and human knowledge through disciplined vision and sustained commitment. Reflection upon this legacy also revealed the paradoxes inherent in immense power. Rockefeller's life was a tapestry of contradictions, an industrial titan criticized for monopoly yet celebrated for efficiency, a man of immense wealth who lived with personal discipline, a figure scrutinized by society who nonetheless influenced global progress quietly and methodically. Yet it was precisely this ability to navigate contradictions, power with ethics, and public scrutiny with private purpose that defined the enduring quality of his legacy. Rockefeller demonstrated that true greatness is rarely linear. It requires navigating complexity with intelligence, patience, and moral clarity, and that the measure of a life lies not only in achievements, but in the capacity to use influence for lasting human benefit. Ultimately, the making of Rockefeller's legacy was a conscious, strategic, and moral endeavor. It illustrated the interplay between wealth, responsibility, and foresight, showing that the power amassed over decades could be transformed into institutions, knowledge, and social advancement that endure far beyond one lifetime. The life of John D. Rockefeller offers a template for understanding the essence of legacy: disciplined vision, ethical application of power, strategic foresight, and a relentless focus on sustainable impact. In the end, Rockefeller's story is not merely about oil, money, or industrial dominance. It is a profound lesson in the careful orchestration of wealth, influence, and moral purpose, a testament to the enduring power of disciplined human agency to shape the world for generations to come. As the 20th century unfolded, John D. Rockefeller's vision extended far beyond the borders of the United States, shaping the contours of global philanthropy and international influence. While Standard Oil had established his name in the realm of industry, it was through strategic, disciplined, and far-reaching philanthropy that Rockefeller ensured his influence would transcend national boundaries and leave an enduring global legacy. Foundations he created began funding medical research, public health programs, education, and agriculture, not only in America but across continents, addressing diseases, improving nutrition, and fostering knowledge in regions previously underserved by modern science and infrastructure. From the eradication of hookworm in the American South to research initiatives in Europe and Asia, Rockefeller's efforts demonstrated a profound understanding that wealth carried a responsibility not only to local communities but to humanity at large. In this way, he transformed the concept of philanthropy from episodic charity to a strategic instrument for systemic global improvement. Applying the same principles of discipline, efficiency, and foresight that had defined his industrial career, Rockefeller's global philanthropic vision was guided by rigorous planning and measurable outcomes, a hallmark of his methodology. He insisted on accountability, research-based interventions, and sustainability, establishing institutions with the capacity to operate independently while adhering to long-term objectives. The Rockefeller Foundation, one of his crowning achievements, became a model for modern philanthropy, setting standards for organizational governance, operational efficiency, and impact measurement. The foundation funded public health campaigns, medical schools, and research laboratories, enabling breakthroughs in medicine, nutrition, and disease prevention. His vision anticipated a world where knowledge and resources could be systematically applied to reduce suffering, improve health, and expand opportunity on a global scale. Through these efforts, Rockefeller's influence became both tangible and enduring, illustrating that wealth, when aligned with purpose and structured execution, can reshape societies far beyond its origin. The global dimension of Rockefeller's philanthropy also reflected his personal philosophy that power and resources are instruments of stewardship rather than mere accumulation. His commitment to systemic solutions rather than temporary fixes revealed a strategic mind capable of envisioning long-term transformation. Education initiatives funded by Rockefeller prepared generations of leaders and scientists, cultivating intellectual capital that transcended borders. Health initiatives not only treated disease, but built infrastructure, training, and knowledge networks that empowered communities to sustain improvements long after initial interventions. In every project, Rockefeller applied the lessons learned from his industrial career: efficiency, planning, accountability, and disciplined oversight. By transforming philanthropy into a global enterprise guided by clear principles and measurable outcomes, He redefined the potential of wealth to serve humanity on a scale previously unimaginable. Even as Rockefeller's influence became global, he remained personally engaged and reflective, ensuring that his actions aligned with his ethical and moral convictions. Despite immense wealth and decades of public scrutiny, he maintained a life of discipline, prayer, and family devotion, understanding that personal integrity underpinned the effectiveness of all his endeavors. His letters, diaries, and recorded reflections reveal a man deeply aware of the ethical implications of power, constantly evaluating how best to deploy resources for maximum benefit. He saw himself not merely as a financier or industrialist, but as a custodian of human potential, tasked with creating institutions and opportunities that would endure across generations and geographies. This mindset set Rockefeller apart from contemporaries whose philanthropic gestures were often reactive, performative, or episodic. His was a vision of strategic, disciplined, and lasting global impact. The impact of Rockefeller's international philanthropy was profound and multifaceted. In medicine, his funding catalyzed breakthroughs in understanding infectious diseases, vaccines, and nutrition, saving millions of lives worldwide. In education, he enabled universities and research centers to develop curricula, train professionals, and conduct studies that influenced policy and practice globally. Agricultural programs improved crop yields, disseminated modern techniques, and enhanced food security in regions struggling with scarcity. The combined effect of these initiatives demonstrated Rockefeller's foresight. He was not merely solving isolated problems, but building enduring systems that amplified human potential across disciplines, continents, and generations. His vision anticipated a modern understanding of global development, emphasizing sustainability, measurement, and systemic change long before such concepts became widespread. Moreover, Rockefeller's global philanthropic influence reinforced his enduring legacy as a figure who bridged industry, morality, and social responsibility. The same discipline, foresight, and strategic thinking that had built Standard Oil were now applied to humanity itself. By transforming wealth into systems of knowledge, health, and opportunity, he illustrated that the true measure of influence extends beyond immediate financial success to encompass lasting human benefit. His global vision also set a precedent, inspiring future generations of philanthropists, industrialists, and global leaders to consider the broader ethical and social responsibilities of concentrated wealth. Rockefeller demonstrated that immense power, when combined with moral clarity, disciplined execution, and strategic foresight, could catalyze change at a scale unmatched by government, individuals, or transient initiatives. In reflecting on Rockefeller's global influence, it becomes evident that his legacy was not confined to oil, industry, or American society. It was, at its core, a testament to the capacity of disciplined vision to effect meaningful, enduring change across borders and generations. By integrating personal ethics, strategic planning, and systemic philanthropy, he created a model for leveraging resources to shape the trajectory of global health, education, and knowledge. Rockefeller's life teaches that legacy is measured not merely by the wealth amassed, but by the enduring institutions, ideas, and systems one leaves behind, a principle that resonates as profoundly today as it did in his own lifetime, demonstrating that the careful, disciplined application of power and resources can create transformative impact for humanity itself. As John D. Rockefeller reached the final decades of his extraordinary life, he devoted increasing attention to contemplating the moral and ethical dimensions of wealth, power, and influence. Having witnessed firsthand the transformative and often disruptive effects of industrial dominance, the rise and regulation of monopolies, and the evolution of public scrutiny, Rockefeller understood that the true test of greatness extended far beyond financial success. Wealth, he realized, was not merely a measure of accumulation or economic leverage, but a profound responsibility that demanded foresight, discipline, and a guiding moral compass. The journey from a small Cleveland household to the pinnacle of American industry had taught him that power, when wielded without ethical grounding, could fracture society and diminish human potential, while conversely, disciplined and principled use of wealth could generate lasting social, scientific, and cultural advancement. Rockefeller's reflections during these years were thus deeply informed by both the practical realities of industrial leadership and the philosophical imperative to deploy resources for the collective good. He often pondered the paradoxes inherent in immense wealth, the tension between personal ambition and public responsibility, the need to maximize efficiency while avoiding exploitation, and the challenge of navigating complex societal expectations while pursuing strategic goals. The controversies surrounding Standard Oil, including public backlash, antitrust litigation, and critical journalism, had underscored the societal scrutiny that accompanies concentrated power. Yet Rockefeller recognized that these challenges were not mere obstacles. They were opportunities for ethical and systemic reflection. Through careful study, he considered how his decisions had affected competitors, workers, communities, and broader economic systems, seeking to understand both the intended and unintended consequences of his actions. This reflective process informed his later approach to philanthropy, institutional governance, and even familial guidance, revealing a profound commitment to aligning practical success with moral responsibility. Central to Rockefeller's ethical framework was the belief that wealth is fundamentally a tool, a resource entrusted to individuals to be managed wisely and purposefully. He rejected the notion that accumulation alone constituted achievement. Rather, he insisted that true success lay in the responsible application of wealth to solve problems, build enduring institutions, and elevate human potential. This conviction drove the design of the Rockefeller Foundation, the University of Chicago, hospitals, research institutes, and global health initiatives. Every grant, endowment, and investment was carefully planned to maximize long-term benefit, with measurable outcomes, rigorous oversight, and sustainability at the core. Through this lens, Rockefeller viewed philanthropy not as a moral obligation imposed by society, but as a deliberate exercise in ethical engineering, transforming financial power into structured systems that magnified positive impact across generations and geographies. Rockefeller's reflections also extended to the interplay between wealth, influence, and societal perception. He understood that immense resources inevitably attracted attention, scrutiny, and moral judgment, and he regarded public opinion as both a constraint and a compass. Maintaining integrity, transparency, and social contribution became central to his approach, reinforcing the principle that ethical stewardship is inseparable from strategic effectiveness. The disciplined routines of his personal life, daily reflection, prayer, and meticulous planning served not only as sources of inner stability, but as mechanisms for ensuring that decisions at every level, from corporate governance to philanthropic allocation, were consistent with his moral vision. In essence, Rockefeller demonstrated that the exercise of wealth is not merely transactional. It is a continuous moral negotiation, balancing ambition, societal expectations, and the long-term consequences of one's actions. Furthermore, Rockefeller's ethical reflections were informed by the enduring paradox of industrial progress, the tension between individual success and collective welfare. He recognized that the systems he had built created both unprecedented opportunity and significant disruption, that economic efficiency sometimes came at the cost of smaller competitors, and that the rapid accumulation of wealth could provoke societal resentment. Yet he responded to these tensions not with defensiveness or avoidance, but with proactive adaptation. Legal challenges, antitrust actions, and public criticism became catalysts for restructuring, reevaluation, and increased social investment. By integrating moral reflection with strategic action, Rockefeller demonstrated that resilience in power requires ethical foresight, a capacity to anticipate the human and societal implications of business decisions, and a commitment to ensuring that influence contributes positively to collective progress. In reflecting on the totality of his life, Rockefeller concluded that wealth and power are inseparable from responsibility, and that the ultimate measure of a person's influence is not the magnitude of their fortune, but the enduring structures, knowledge, and systems they leave behind. He understood that institutions built with discipline, foresight, and ethical purpose could outlast generations, influencing not only immediate outcomes, but the long-term trajectory of society. The universities, research centers, hospitals, and foundations he had established were more than monuments to personal achievement. They were living embodiments of his philosophy, representing the potential for wealth to serve as a force for constructive transformation, education, and human flourishing. Ultimately, Rockefeller's reflections on wealth, power, and ethics offer a timeless lesson that extraordinary capability must be guided by disciplined vision, moral clarity, and a commitment to sustainable impact. His life illustrates that influence is most meaningful when it balances strategic intelligence with ethical stewardship, ambition with responsibility, and operational mastery with long-term societal benefit. By navigating decades of public scrutiny, legal challenges, and ethical dilemmas, Rockefeller not only preserved his fortune and influence, but also created a framework for understanding how wealth, power, and ethics intersect to shape history. His legacy stands as a testament to the transformative potential of disciplined human agency, offering guidance to leaders, philanthropists, and visionaries for generations to come. In the final analysis, John D. Rockefeller's life embodies the principle that wealth, when wielded with foresight, purpose, and moral clarity, can transcend personal gain to create enduring societal and global impact, a lesson as vital today as it was in the age of America's first billionaire.